This is the story of what happened between me and Colin. We were business partners for a while. I won't say exactly what kind of business, but yeah, it wasn't legal. But we never killed anyone. For a while we made a lot of money, but Colin was always riding me about this and that. He was an instigator. And he made fun of me a lot because I made the mistake of telling him I was in the hospital a couple of times up in Mariniac. I took the abuse because I needed him for the business. He had a way of making people afraid of him. Once in a while we got kind of into a shoving match. One was so bad the police had to come. That time it was because he kept calling me stupid. People have been calling me stupid all my life. But that time I lost it. And then one day I did something really bad, I admit it. I made a pass at his girlfriend. And he found out about it and he called me and told me he was going to kill me. And that was the end of the business. Like he cared. His family was already so rich he never had to work a day in his life. He did something worse than try to kill me, though. He did something worse. One night, about 3 weeks after Colin threatened me, I was making a run of goods out to the sailboat. We'd bought an old junky sailboat and kept it tied up in Innsfell, way out beyond the state line on the Cargo River. The goods were always safe there. So I drove out this one night in August. I got a little scared because I thought I was being followed. This pickup truck was behind me all the way down County Route 7, and it turned when I turned twice. And I thought, he's really going to do it. Colin's going to kill me. There was one stoplight in Innsfell, and when it turned green, I just waited a minute to see what the pickup truck behind me was going to do. And it didn't do anything. It just idled. Didn't honk at me. As soon as I moved through the light, though, it turned left. So by the time I got to the sailboat, I was already on edge. The boat was always all alone, tied up to this dock at the edge of an empty property we'd bought. No one was around for almost a mile in any direction. It was just woods. I drove down the dirt access road and parked in the clearing beside the river. As soon as I turned off the engine, I heard a thud from the back of the car. And then I heard it again, coming from the trunk. And it came again. Something was in there. I had the goods in a box in the back seat, but I ignored them for now. I got out of the car and I left the door open, and I walked around to the back. I put my key into the trunk real slow. And when I thought I was ready, I opened the trunk all at once. And what I saw in there made me scream and scream. And I turned and I ran into the woods down the access road, and I never stopped. And I screamed until it felt like I broke something in my throat. And the next thing I remember, I was almost run over on the road by two teenagers in a Honda. They got out, and I guess I was babbling and crying, and they couldn't understand me, so they just pointed me into the back seat, and we drove, and finally I calmed down. About 5 miles down the road, they pulled up at a police station, and they said the police would help me. I got out, but I didn't go in there, obviously. I'll tell you what I saw in the trunk. You see, I had said too much to Colin during the time we were partners, and he used it against me. We all have irrational fears, and some people have them so bad they can't function if what they're afraid of gets too close to them. I knew a woman couldn't look at a picture of a snake in a kid's storybook from across a room. For me, since I was real small, I've been afraid of something like that. I can't say the word for what it is. I can't even say it. But I can describe it. What I'm talking about is the things that live only at night and suck your blood. When I was a kid, I remember this photo taken from a frame of some movie. It was that actor Christopher Lee, and his eyes were all red, and his mouth was open, and you could see his fangs, and he was about to bite into this woman's neck. And I cried all night when I saw that, alone in my room. And there was a movie with a thing that called itself Barlow, and his head was shaved, and his eyes were like white marbles, and he had claws. And when I saw him by accident, I had to be taken out of school, and I didn't go back for a long time. Whenever they made me talk to a doctor, they made me talk about how much I was afraid of those things. I even had to talk about them up in Meridiac. Colin had paid someone to hide in the trunk. And when I opened it, whoever it was dressed in a long black gown like a monk. But he had blood smeared all over his face, and he opened his mouth wide, and he had long, sharp teeth, and he said something to me as he tried to get out of the trunk. And what he said was, "Let me feed, let me feed." Seeing that made something go dark in my brain, and it felt like my arms had electricity shooting up and down them, and one of the blood vessels in my eyes broke. So not only did Colin scare me so bad that I almost had to go to Meridiac again, but he humiliated me. He made me cry so hard and lose the power of speech so that 2 high school kids had to help me. And they probably called me stupid when they drove away. So I vowed I would get back at him. I was so sleep deprived with the fear for a whole week after that, I couldn't function normally. But when my mind was clear, I began to think of a plan. I didn't want to just hurt Colin, like hire someone to beat him up. That was too easy. I wanted to hurt his mind. It took me months to come up with the plan, but I didn't mind waiting. It was the hand of God that gave me the plan. It really was. I was sitting in a bar, and I was talking to the bartender about Bandage Man, who was this guy nobody knew who you would see once a year or so if you were lucky, a guy who lived in town somewhere. And when you did see him, his head was mostly bandaged up like he had been injured and never healed. And he wore these big prescription sunglasses, those wraparound sunglasses that cover half your face. And he always wore an Orioles baseball cap real low over his face. So obviously he was a freak of some kind, maybe a burn victim, something nobody knew, but this bartender said he knew what the story was. This bartender was new, and he lived out on Arrow Road, and he said the Bandage Man lived 6 houses down in a dumpy little house with rotting paint and overgrown weeds. The bartender said he'd heard what the story was from the postman. Bandage Man had been on full disability all his adult life because of what his problem was. I didn't believe it when the bartender described it. But he wasn't lying, you see. It was true. Bandage Man almost never left his house, but when he did, I was going to be ready. I paid one of the guys I used to sell stuff to, this guy named Gary, to sneak in there when Bandage Man was gone and look around. And he found proof. He found some photographs. And he took one of them and he brought it back to show me. I wouldn't look at it. That was too scary. But I accepted it as proof. And that's when I knew what I could do to Colin. I didn't know Colin's fears, mind you. He was a tough guy. He never talked about them, but it was worth trying what I had in mind. So I sent a letter to Bandage Man's house telling him I was going to come to him on Saturday morning with $5,000 and a proposition. I didn't hear back from him, but I rang the doorbell anyway, a week later, and he answered. And the deal got made without me ever having to see under the bandages. 2 days after Christmas, I got a call from Colin's girlfriend, that slag. She said Colin was in the ICU at Holy Cross. He'd had a massive heart attack the day before. 41 years old, and he'd had a massive heart attack, and I got the chills because, of course, I knew exactly why. I just couldn't believe that what I'd planned could give Colin such a shock that it would kill him. He was a chain smoker and a little overweight, but I knew right away it was that shock I had designed that had worked perfectly. I guess it had all happened exactly like I dreamed. 911 had gotten an anonymous call that someone was unconscious at that address. Colin was in a coma, on life support. Do you want to know what did that to Colin? Okay. Imagine it's really late, past midnight, and you've been out at a bar in town, the one you always go to, and you go back to your house alone because someone knew that on this night your slag girlfriend was out of town. And you go into your empty house, just wanting to sleep, and you put a case of beer on the kitchen counter, and you take off your jacket, and you walk into your bedroom. It's pitch dark, and you feel around for the light for a second, and then you turn it on. And the first thing that hits your senses is that there's a man in a chair in the very middle of the room, a stranger in your house. And that first bolt of fear rips into your brain before you even know what you're looking at. And the man is big. He's got big hands on the arms of that chair. And he's dressed in really old, musty clothes. But his face is really all you see. It's an older face. And that man has just one staring eye in the center of his forehead. He's a cyclops from Perth. A real one, not from a book about myths. And when you see that, your heart seizes up. You probably see that face all the way through your collapse to the floor, even as you scream and the lights go out inside your mind. So that's what happened to Colin. And even though I felt great at first, it was only a few days before I started to become afraid. I'd gone too far, and when Colin woke up, he wouldn't settle things, he would kill me. I was almost certain he'd killed someone before. Not paid someone to do it, mind you, he did it himself. His friend Gary, who was just as much of a bully, he mentioned it to me once. He said Colin had hung this guy who'd taken a shot at him from a passing car, hung him in a basement in San Diego. Just did that, and watched the guy die. Colin was capable. He would get revenge. In a way, the thought of getting stabbed or shot or even hung wasn't as scary as what he could really do to me. He could make me see one of those things again, the things that I mentioned. He had the money to do almost anything to me. Colin didn't wake up in 2 weeks or even a month. He stayed on life support. But he had it easier than me. I got so scared of what was going to happen to me that I started screwing up in my business dealings. I couldn't focus. I had to buy sedatives so I could sleep. I kept dreaming that I was hearing a noise inside my trunk late at night, out in the middle of nowhere. And when I went to open it, Colin was inside, but he was different. He was wearing a dark cape and his hair had grown down over his shoulders, but it was all stringy and clotted with dirt, like he'd woken up from being dead. And in the dream he lunged out at me. After the dreams really turned bad, which was 6 months after Colin went into the coma, I started to have terrible headaches and I lost a lot of weight. And for a while, 3 or 4 weeks, I couldn't go out of the house. I was driving along in the rain, I think, and the voices on the radio started to sound like they were shouting at me, and I was trying to shut it off, and the car went off the road and I hit a tree. I got out and I walked to this farmhouse to keep dry. And I walked right through the front door, and there were people inside. And they were scared of me. And for some reason I broke all the windows, every single one, and the people ran out of there. And the police came and got me. And they put me in Sparrows Point. And I was on and off heavier sedatives for a while. They kept me in there because I had a record with that place too. They thought I was really messed up. When I got out after a longer time than I'd ever been in one of those places, I felt really strange, like I shouldn't be out of there. but they didn't let me stay. I was afraid to tell them that I was starting to see the things that only lived at night and sucked people's blood. I saw them when I closed my eyes. And sometimes at night when I looked out my window at the field outside, the trees looked like them to me. The branches were claws, and sometimes the bumps and the curves in the tree, they became faces. And sometimes when it was windy late at night, I could see the branches outside my window bend down and kind of swipe at the glass, touching it. And those were the claws reaching out for me. The very first night I left Sparrow's Point, I went to a motel to start living there. And I sat on the edge of the bed for hours because I kept hearing water going through the pipes all around me. And I was thinking about a blood-sucking man squeezing himself through the pipes, moving real slow, but trying to figure out which pipes went toward me and the room I was in, and waiting for me to fall asleep so we could climb out and wait in the bathroom, listening through the door for the sound of my breathing to go completely even. And then he would come in and bend down beside me, and his eyes would turn from black to red, and he would sink his teeth into my neck. Blood would spurt out so much that he would have to turn his head fast, left and right, to try to catch it all. But it would splash on his face, and he would smile because that's what he loved the most about killing. I went to the library, and it was tough to read about the things because of all the pictures. I couldn't look at any of the pictures or I'd pass out. So I had to find books where there weren't any of those. And I read a lot about the beings I feared. And I found out a lot. There were stories no one talked about. And they confirmed what I had always been most scared of, which was that maybe, just maybe, they weren't always a myth. You probably don't know, for instance, about the butcher killings in Quebec in 1979, where 6 of the 8 victims had their throats punctured by something. Or the ones that happened in Ho Chi Minh City in the 5 years after the Vietnam War ended. There in that city walked a man that the people living there called the Laughing Cat. When they were investigating the murders he did, they figured out that he was waiting under people's beds for them to go to sleep. He got into the places they lived and he waited. And when the dark came, he killed them. Bites all over the people, not just their necks, their feet and their legs. They never found out who did it. They called him the Laughing Cat because he was so clever, and they couldn't solve how he got into their bedrooms. He was probably invited in. Colin died only about 6 weeks after I got out of Sparrow's Point. He'd been in that coma for 370 days. And the paper said his body finally just failed. I was living there in the motel room, and Gary tracked me down, and he came to see me and to ask me if I had heard about Colin. I almost didn't want to let him into the room because I knew he'd react badly to what he saw. I could sense him looking around the room and taking it in and seeing that I had taped 3 crosses to the windows. And I bought a bunch of garlic and I put it near the window in the bathroom. He saw that, and even though he didn't say anything about it, I knew he was judging me. I knew he thought I was crazy. We were sitting there, and I was wondering why Gary wasn't leaving. But I was grateful he was there because the sun was going down, and when that happened, sometimes I just crawled into bed and turned the TV on loud and kind of hid under the covers. And sometimes I got under the bed. So it was good to have a second person there. But then he told me about Colin's body. Somehow I knew it was coming, what he told me. He said Colin's body had disappeared for a while after he died, right from the morgue. Disappeared, and no one really understood why, or if someone had taken it. When Gary told me that, I think I must have gotten incoherent because I remember him pushing me away from him over and over again, and finally he was leaving the room. And I spent that night in the bathroom so I could listen to the pipes better and be real close to the one under the bathtub to make sure nothing happened. I didn't really believe it could, but my head hurt less when I was in there. And I pulled the TV in there and I put it into the bathtub so it covered the drain. I stayed up all night starting then, and I slept during the day. What I thought might be true about Colin obviously was. And for weeks I stayed in the room and I ordered food delivered to me and thought about a plan. Time got strange and sometimes I forgot to eat. And once I even forgot to drink water for so long, I passed out twice. I kept the TV in the tub to block the drain, so I could only wash myself in the sink. I ordered 50 or 60 books off the internet and I spent my days reading. There were so many stories about the suckers of blood, you wouldn't believe it. I'd gone my whole life without understanding how many there really were. I don't know how I got the courage to do what I did. But maybe it wasn't courage so much as the thought that I was going to die in that room if I didn't act. It was going to be me killing Colin or him killing me. So I had a choice. I still had $40,000 in the bank, and if I know one thing in life, it's that you can pay for almost anything. So I did calculations, and when I was done, I spent a whole day making myself look presentable for when I went out. I had to find this guy named Chipper who would do things for pay, almost anything. He was in Newark, so I drove there, and he was easy to find. He reacted real strangely to me because I couldn't stop myself from talking about the suckers of blood. I really couldn't, so I scared him. But he agreed to do what I was paying him for, even though he asked for most of the money up front. I wrote down every detail of what I needed in another motel room, and when I gave those notes to him, I was surprised that it was pages and pages. He said, "What is this? What is this?" I got a call from Gary 3 days before my final confrontation with Colin. He said that Chipper had told him what I wanted to do. Gary was apologizing. He said he had lied to me when he said that thing about Colin's body disappearing. He said he'd just been trying to scare me. When he saw I was so freaked out with the crosses and the garlic, he decided to put a scare into me, sort of as revenge, because he'd always liked Colin, and he kind of knew that I must have done something to hurt him. But it was a lie, and I should stop what I was doing. And then I knew that he was protecting Colin. But I played along. I told him, yes, I had lost control a bit, but I was better now. Of course my plan was crazy. I made him believe me, and he hung up, and I called Chipper right away, and I told him that if he didn't follow my instructions to the letter, he would get nothing more from me, and that if he made one more call to anyone about it, I would kill him. The timing was the most important thing about what he needed to do, the timing. The night before the plan was executed, I spent all night pacing in my room. The phone rang the next day at noon, just when I had dictated. Chipper told me that it was all done. I had to act fast. I was more scared than I had ever been, but the thought that at sundown it would be all over gave me the strength to get in the car and drive toward Innsfell. Even the trip out there was full of little scares because of the rain. The rain was so bad I had to pull over a couple of times. They'd warned everyone about it on the radio, but I had no choice but to go out there in it. It poured from first light and it never stopped, and the wind was bad sometimes too. Terrible rain it was. It was usually like a half-hour drive out to Innsfell, but it took an hour and 15 minutes, and I needed every second of daylight to do what needed to be done. By the time I got to the access road on the property I'd bought with Colin back in the day, it was almost completely washed out. The car spun out in the mud a few times, but I was lucky I didn't get stuck. And soon the river was in view, and there was the sailboat, tied up where I'd left it. I hadn't seen it for almost 2 months. The wind had died down, but it was still rocking the sailboat a little just from the force of the rain pelting the water. I got out of the car, and from the back seat I took the stake and the hammer and the saw. To keep my mind flat and calm, I began to recite the lyrics to a hymn I had read in the Bible back at the motel. I'd read that hymn a few hundred times and I'd committed it to memory. I'll tell you how it goes. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss and pour contempt on all my pride. Forbid it, Lord, that I should boast, save in the death of Christ my God. All the vain things that charm me most, I sacrifice them to his blood. See from his head, his hands, his feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown? His dying crimson like a robe spreads over his body on the tree. Then I am dead to all the globe, and all the globe is dead to me. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. I went through the whole thing again and again as I splashed through the rain toward the sailboat. I was soaking wet by the time I got to it. I climbed down into the hold, and I was finally out of the awful weather. The coffin was in the hold, in the middle of the floor. Chipper had brought it there, through the driving rain. No doubt he had plenty of assistance. The coffin looked incredibly heavy, even though it wasn't anything more than a pine box. There was some kind of marking on it, some symbol. They'd waited until dawn, when I told them they'd be safe from Colin. And they'd broken into Colin's family crypt out in Doncaster and pulled it out of there. Never again would Colin return from a nighttime feeding and crawl back in there. My hands were shaking so bad when I went about opening the coffin that I had to take one of the pills they gave me up at Sparrow's Point, and I waited for it to kick in. It took about 20 minutes. And then I picked up the stake I'd pulled up from my old neighbor's yard the month before, the stake his dog was usually tied to. And I undid the latch, and I closed my eyes and I opened the lid. Colin didn't look like he used to. He didn't look like he used to. I felt like I was going to faint, and then time got very strange. I didn't move for so long that when I became aware of what was going on again, a lot more light had left the sky. It all came crashing through to me then. And I left Colin where he was, and I went back out into the rain, and I got in the car. I'd missed it entirely. Colin wasn't the one. Do you see? There are other reasons a man might suffer a heart attack than getting a shock, like massive blood loss. And there are other reasons a man would wrap his head in bandages all the time and try to never leave his house, because the sunlight is too painful. The drive back to town was slow, and with the pill I took, it made it really tough to find Arrow Road. I only had like another half hour before the sun went down. The house was just like how I'd seen it the first time. We're in even worse shape now. I picked the lock on the back door. It was almost falling off anyway. The sound of the rain probably drowned out the sound of me going in. I crept through the living room and down a hallway. The first door I tried was a bedroom. Bandage Man was lying there on his side, facing away from me, asleep. And I imagined what it was going to feel like after I had saved so many lives by killing that stalker of the dark, drinker of blood, devourer of life.